often without us even realizing it. We're talking about how our perception of reality is shaped, steered, and sometimes completely re-engineered. We mean those invisible forces that influence what we believe, what we fear, even how we connect. It's a journey into the very architecture of control itself.
Indeed. And we've gathered a really fascinating stack of sources for this one. We've got insights from a former KGB defector, pioneers in public relations, studies on group psychology, and also contemporary analyses of media and surveillance. So a broad range. Our mission.
Unpack this then. What we're about to explore, it might feel unsettling at times, maybe even a little disorienting. But understanding these mechanisms, well, that's the first absolutely crucial step toward reclaiming some autonomy. For you, our listener, this deep dive is designed as a kind of shortcut, a way to quickly grasp and recognize the subtle, and sometimes frankly not so subtle, ways external forces try to program our minds. Our goal is to equip you to make more sensible, independent conclusions, especially when you're faced with just this overwhelming abundance of information out there. So we're starting with a stark, almost chilling framework. It's laid out by Yuri Bezmenov, a former KGB defector. He described something he called ideological subversion. But before we dive into all the intricate stages, can you give us the quick version? What is ideological subversion at its core, in plain language?
Essentially, ideological subversion, as Bezmenov explained it, it's a non-military strategy. It's designed to conquer a nation, not with bullets, no, but by subtly twisting its people's minds over generations. It's really about fundamentally altering a nation's perception of reality. So much so that despite an abundance of information being available, people become incapable of reaching sensible conclusions. It's winning, as he put it, without a single shot being fired, simply by changing what people think is real and even desirable.
That is chilling. So it's not about spies hiding in the shadows or bombs. It's a much more insidious, long-term psychological game. Bezmenov emphasized it's not traditional espionage, so what makes it so different? And why is it apparently so hard for society to even recognize when it's happening?
Well, what's fascinating here and kind of disturbing is that Bezmenov stressed its aggressive, destructive activity is often overt, legitimate, and easily observable. And it's observable precisely because it's not a crime, according to anything of value in the enemy country. The ultimate goal is to warp their perception of reality so profoundly that they don't even see you as an enemy anymore. Your system, your civilization, your ambitions, well, they start to look like a viable, maybe even a desirable alternative. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Bezmenov breaks it down into 4 distinct sequential stages. Each one builds on the last.
4 stages. Okay. And the first one, demoralization. That sounds like the longest, maybe the most foundational, lasting 15 to 20 years, you said.
Yeah.
Why such a long game for this initial crucial phase? That's a generation.
That duration, Bezmenov explained, is absolutely critical, 15 to 20 years. That's the minimum time needed to fully educate or maybe indoctrinate one generation into the enemy's ideology. The goal is to slowly, almost imperceptibly erode a society's moral fabric. It's about making its people fundamentally unable to assess true information, to the point where even when they're confronted with, say, authentic proof, they will refuse to believe it until, as he bluntly put it, he's going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. It's a profound psychological conditioning, a really deep rewiring.
So if I'm hearing this right, the goal of demoralization isn't just like making people unhappy or cynical. It's to fundamentally disconnect them from any reliable source of truth, from their faith, their education, their community, essentially leaving them unmoored, unable to think critically, even when facts are staring them right in the face. It's like creating this persistent mental fog designed to last for decades. What exactly does that erosion look like in practice? What are the key targets, the tactics during this long-term demoralization?
That's a perfect summary. It is that systematic, multi-pronged attack designed to create that fog. First, religion is targeted. The strategy isn't always, overt prohibition. Often it's to destroy it, ridicule it, replace it with various sex cults or other distractions, anything that pulls people away from traditional faith and accepted dogma. The deeper aim, Bezmenov argued, is to take away the supreme purpose of religion, to keep people in touch with the supreme being, and replace it with something ephemeral or maybe self-indulgent, which thereby removes a core source of moral guidance and, importantly, communal strength.
So it's not just discrediting a belief system, but actually removing a foundational sense of purpose. The connection. That creates a huge emotional, spiritual void, doesn't it? And then how does that void get exploited or filled, particularly when we look at education?
Precisely. That void is, well, it's fertile ground for subversion. So next, education shifts its focus, often dramatically. Instead of prioritizing, say, constructive, pragmatic, efficient subjects, like math, physics, engineering, even classical literature, the curriculum gets subtly redirected. Bezmenov noted a shift towards things like history of urban warfare, natural food, home economy, or sexuality. Anything, he said, as long as it takes you away from essential critical knowledge and skills. The intent seems to be creating a generation that's less equipped to build, to innovate, or even to critically analyze complex problems, replacing practical competence with ideological or sometimes superficial concerns.
Making people less capable,
Yeah.
less connected to foundational truths and practical skills. Wow, that sounds incredibly insidious. It's like a dismantling of intellectual capacity over time. What about our social fabric? The way we interact, form communities. How is that targeted?
Absolutely. That's next. In social life, traditional institutions that foster community and individual initiative, they get replaced with artificially bureaucratically controlled bodies. Think things like social workers institutions, which may be well-intentioned on the surface, can end up replacing organic community support systems. The concern, Bezmenov observed, often becomes the paycheck rather than the well-being of families or genuine social relations. It fosters dependency rather than, say, self-reliance. Similarly, the existing power structure, including administration and media, sees natural administrative bodies subtly substituted by artificial bodies. These are often groups of people whom nobody elected. These unelected groups might be disliked by the public, but they accumulate influence anyway. Bezmenov specifically questioned the media's monopolistic power on your mind and its self-appointed authority to decide what is good and what is bad for elected leaders, essentially positioning itself as an arbiter of truth rather than just a reporter of facts.
So it's a deliberate undermining of both personal agency and legitimate authority, fostering this sense of distrust in existing structures. What happens to the guardians of order during this phase? How is respect for the law eroded?
Well, for law enforcement, there's a systematic erosion of respect for law and order. Bezmenov noted police are increasingly depicted as dumb, angry, psychotic, paranoid, basically villainized. Conversely, criminals are often humanized, portrayed sometimes as nice human beings who are just oppressed by society. This isn't just about media portrayals, though. It's about actively fostering hatred, mistrust towards those who enforce law and order, leading to a state of moral relativity where, as he put it, a criminal is not a criminal, actually. He's a defendant.
Oh,
Which is a profound reversal of societal norms, isn't it? Blurring the lines of justice, undermining public safety.
it certainly is. And how does this play out in the economic sphere? What about the relationship between workers and employers? And the very concept of fairness, even.
Labor relations are also systematically targeted. The goal, according to Bezmenov, is to destroy traditionally established links of bargaining between employer and employee. Trade unions, which were originally designed for worker improvement, become ideologically driven, leading to prolonged strikes where often only the leaders benefit. Meanwhile, the fundamental freedom of worker to sell his labor according to his own desire and will is taken away. The worker becomes just a pawn in a larger ideological game. And finally, there's a heavy promotion of equality. Bezmenov calls the relentless propaganda for absolute equality as universally desirable, false, and a lie, describing it like building a house on sand. He contrasted this with the founders' vision of democracy where unequal people have a chance to survive and help each other in constant competition, arguing that absolute equality, when forced, stifles individual ambition and societal advancement. The outcome of all this, a population so influenced that exposure to true information does not matter anymore. They are literally unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Just until, again, they receive that kick in his fat bottom, meaning a brutal, undeniable confrontation with reality.
That's a truly disturbing picture. How a society's core values, institutions, even its capacity for rational thought, can be systematically dismantled over decades. So after 15 to 20 years of this deep demoralization, we hit a much shorter phase, destabilization, lasting, what, 2 to 5 years? What's the fundamental change in focus here? How does it build on the groundwork laid in that first long stage?
That's a crucial point. The shift in pace and focus is really stark. Once a generation is sufficiently demoralized, this stage aims to destabilize all the relations, all the accepted institutions and organizations. The subverter no longer needs to just subtly undermine ideas, they move to attacking the essentials. Things like the economy, foreign relations, defense systems. This is where calculated turmoil becomes much more overt. Compromise becomes impossible. There's a rapid radicalization of human relations. Conflict isn't just present, it becomes the norm, whether it's between family members, neighbors, or large societal groups. Violent classes are not only accepted, but are frequently presented as normal, even necessary.
So it sounds like the polite maybe simmering disagreement at the demoralization stage escalates into open, maybe even violent conflict. The gloves really come off. Where do the agents of this destabilization come from? How do they push society towards this brink?
This is where Bezmenov's concept of sleepers comes into play. They spring to action. These are individuals, often trained in foreign ideologies. He specifically mentioned students from places like Lumumba University back in the day. They've been quietly integrated into society for years, perhaps decades, during that demoralization phase. Now, they step forward. They become leaders of groups, preachers, public figures. Their role is to actively create and exacerbate antagonistic clashes, sometimes militantly, sometimes even with firearms, between various societal groups. For instance, he mentioned pitting black against white, yellows against green, deliberate division. Bezmenov noted that many of these individuals are simply KGB agents, often funded by what he termed sympathetic Americans, people from various foundations, perhaps inadvertently, maybe otherwise, aiding the subversion. This orchestrated antagonism pushes society toward a complete breakdown of law and order, where differences are increasingly settled through emotionally charged court cases for the smallest irrelevant cases. And the media, rather than being a neutral observer, actively puts itself in opposition to society at large, just fueling the division.
From demoralization to destabilization, the pace quickens dramatically. And then we hit crisis. Up to 6 weeks, you said? That's an incredibly rapid shift from destabilization to outright societal collapse. What happens when a society hits this point? And how does the strategy capitalize on that chaos?
Indeed, this engineered chaos quickly pushes a country to the verge of crisis, potentially within just up to 6 weeks. At this point, society simply cannot function any more productively. It collapses.
Yeah.
Infrastructure might falter. Essential services could break down. Daily life becomes a struggle. And in this vacuum of order and meaning, the population at large is looking for a savior. They desperately seek a strong man, a leader, a messiah. Religious groups might expect some kind of divine intervention. Workers might desire a strong government, maybe a socialist government centralized. Anything, really, to restore stability. It's a very primal human response to overwhelming chaos.
So the very instability creates this profound demand for an authoritarian solution. And who steps into that void to seize power, especially after such a rapid breakdown?
Precisely. This is the moment for those artificial bodies or non-elected committees to seize power, often by force if denied. Bezmenov characterized these individuals sometimes as half-baked intellectuals. Maybe they graduated from Harvard University or Berkeley, returned to their countries convinced they know the answer to all the social economical problems. Quote, "These self-appointed rulers, often backed by the subverting force, step into the power vacuum created. This intense period of engineered turmoil culminates, potentially, in civil war and invasion." Bezmenov used examples like Lebanon, where he said civil war was artificially implanted, or East European countries facing Soviet invasion. It's the final, often brutal, consolidation of control.
And that leads us to the fourth and final stage, normalization. But normalization by force, that sounds like a deeply ironic and chilling name for the final stage. What does this phase entail? And what happens to the very people who helped bring about the subversion? Those activists, those intellectuals you mentioned?
It is deeply ironic, yes. It's a term borrowed directly from Soviet propaganda. It implies a return to order, but it's under a completely imposed system. This stage can last indefinitely. The new self-appointed rulers establish stability, yes, but it's stability by force. And here's perhaps the most chilling part. The defining characteristic is the systematic elimination of the very revolutionaries and useful idiots, as Bezmenov called them, who helped create the chaos in the first place. The activists, the social workers, the liberals, the Marxists who fueled the destabilization are being eliminated physically because, as Bezmenov starkly put it, they've done their job already. He cited examples from Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Grenada, where former Marxist leaders were assassinated or imprisoned by new, even more Marxist comrades. The logic is just brutal. The new rulers need stability to exploit the nation. And those who thrive on revolution, well, they are now a threat to the new imposed order.
So what's the core insight we should take away from Bezmenov's entire framework here?
Yeah.
The very people who helped create the chaos are discarded once control is established. It's a brutal, cynical logic at the heart of ideological subversion. The message seems to be, once you've served your purpose, you are utterly expendable.
Exactly. The core insight is that, for Bezmenov, ideological subversion is a ruthless, long-term political warfare strategy. It exploits human nature. It exploits societal vulnerabilities. It doesn't value ideals or individuals. It only values achieving total control. The useful idiots, as he called them, are merely tools in a process designed to fundamentally alter a nation's soul. and prepare it for foreign domination, or at least external control, culminating in a state where dissent is crushed and any original purpose or value is just stripped away. It's essentially a blueprint for dismantling a society from within, making it ripe for takeover, all without a conventional war.
That Bismunoff framework paints a really disturbing picture of long-term strategic subversion. But for that kind of manipulation to actually work, it has to tap into something deep within us, doesn't it? Which brings us to how powerful entities actually leverage our inherent human psychology, much like Edward Bernays described with his concept of the invisible government.
Mhm.
How do these psychological principles enable what Bezmenov outlined?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yeah, Bernays' insights are absolutely foundational here. He, the pioneer of public relations, articulated the core idea really clearly that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. He wasn't subtle about it. He argued that a relatively small number of people are constantly pulling the wires which control the public mind. By understanding deep-seated group dynamics and, crucially, unconscious desires, he effectively described an invisible government operating behind the scenes, shaping what we think and feel.
So it's not just about logical arguments or, policies. It's about bypassing conscious reason entirely and tapping into something much more primal.
Exactly. This manipulation often bypasses conscious reason, appeals instead to those deep-seated, often suppressed emotions and hidden desires.
Mhm.
Bernays viewed public relations not just as, informing people, but as a form of warfare on people,
Mm.
aimed squarely at bending their will. He cited powerful examples. The U.S. Committee on Public Information in 1917, for instance. They effectively sold WWI to Americans, not through facts, but by appealing directly to raw emotion. Think of propaganda showing the Statue of Liberty in tatters, or a gorilla in a German helmet. Designed, as one official said, to scare the hell out of people and grab them by their emotions. Another famous example was his Torches of Freedom campaign. He linked women smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes to women's liberation, creating an association between the product and this powerful, emerging social desire, making smoking seem rebellious, modern, and empowering for women at the time.
That's a masterclass in psychological influence, really. And it seems even more potent when individuals are part of a larger collective. Our sources suggest people are easier to manipulate when they're part of a group. And here's where it gets really interesting in understanding why that is.
Precisely. Individuals derive this enlarged sense of self-importance and feelings of potency from identifying with a powerful group. The sources use the analogy, just as the wolf pack is many times as strong as the combined strength of its individual members. This primal instinct for tribal organization, for safety and strength in numbers, it still looms large in our psychology. It's a powerful force, and one that can definitely be channeled.
And what impact does that group identification have on an individual's critical thinking? Does that sense of belonging actually override their personal judgment?
Absolutely. When an individual identifies strongly with a group, their critical faculty is significantly weakened. Freud, for instance, noted that a group has no critical faculty of its own, which makes individuals within it extraordinarily credulous and open to influence. They will often subordinate self-analysis and a discerning search for the truth in favor of maintaining group interests and cohesion. So the individual's personal skepticism or critical evaluation just takes a back seat to the group's narrative. This vulnerability makes them highly susceptible to psychological operations designed to target suppressed or unconscious desires and emotions. This, according to Bernays, is exactly how that invisible government of society subtly manipulates collective motives and behavior.
That's a profound insight into how our social instincts can be, weaponized.
Yeah.
But this isn't just some old trick from the history books, is it? Today, our digital lives seem like a constant battleground for our minds. Social media, technology, they seem intricately designed to capture and hold our attention, often in ways that are far from benign.
Absolutely. The landscape has definitely evolved, but the underlying psychological principles are very much the same. Now, a handful of tech companies literally steer what a billion people are thinking today. How? By scheduling little blocks of time in our minds through constant notifications, feeds, algorithms. The hidden goal driving modern technology, many sources argue, is explicitly the race for our attention. They employ incredibly sophisticated techniques like autoplay features on videos, maybe snap streaks on platforms like Snapchat, which create this pervasive fear of losing streaks among teenagers, effectively compelling daily engagement. It's an orchestration by, as one source put it, 100 engineers on the other side of the screen who knew exactly how your psychology worked. creating what's described as a double bind, a kind of no-win situation where disengaging comes with a real social or psychological cost.
So it's a very deliberate engineered system just to keep us hooked almost unconsciously.
Hmm.
But beyond just engagement, what role does outrage play in this digital orchestration? Why is it so effective?
Outrage is a really potent tool, mainly because we don't choose outrage. It happens to us. It's visceral. Algorithms, especially on platforms like Facebook's news feed back in the day, were arguably designed to prioritize the outrage feed. Why? Because it encourages sharing. Sharing boosts engagement. Engagement means more ad revenue. This system, driven largely by advertising models, allows anyone who pays enough to precisely target a lie directly to the people who are most susceptible to that specific narrative. The consequences are profound. These communicational parasites, like smartphones and social media, they fragment our attention, make sustained focus incredibly difficult, contribute to an age of anxiety, and ultimately, some argue, prevent the kind of collective critical group consciousness needed to challenge these systems. The human mind, like a computer, is programmable when its input is controlled. This creates a kind of curated existence, an illusion of choice built within the walls of a digital cage. Insecurities are often invented, and then the cures are sold back to us. Our very worth gets branded by what we can afford or how we conform online.
That's a powerful and disturbing image. Our minds being actively programmed. And our sources repeatedly highlight fear as a core mechanism within this larger strategy of control. Why is fear so potent? How does it play into this mental programming?
Fear is one of the most powerful human emotions simply because it's so primal, so deeply wired into our survival instincts. When individuals are gripped by fear of a threat, real or imagined, their rational and higher cognitive capacities shut down. This makes them easily manipulated by anyone that promises safety from the threat. The 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke noted that no passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear. Ruling classes for literally thousands of years have understood this, and they often artificially maintained fear among the population, precisely because a fearful population is easier to control than a fearless one.
That historical context is crucial. It shows it's not a new phenomenon, but rather an ancient, refined art of social control. How does this age-old tactic manifest in contemporary politics and societal narratives today?
Political exploitation of fear is rampant. It's perennial. H.L. Mencken observed, quite cynically, that the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. Politicians use fear to gain votes, appealing to primal anxieties, job security, social instability, perceived external threats. This actively fuels tribalism, that evolutionary advantage promoting group cohesion against perceived other tribes. This us versus them dynamic is incredibly potent. It short-circuits empathy, encourages uncritical alignment with one's own group against the perceived enemy.
And beyond overt politics, where else does this fear-based manipulation show up in our daily lives? Often in ways we might not immediately recognize.
Oh, fear extends to numerous domains, often subtly shaping our choices. In education, you might see career fear used to push individuals towards specific paths deemed more secure. In religion, fear of divine judgment or afterlife consequences can motivate adherence and obedience. In marketing, the fear of missing out, FOMO, and artificial scarcity drive impulse purchases. And even in relationships, societal beliefs can be influenced by fear-driven narratives about loneliness or threats to traditional structures. The effect on the psyche is profound. Propagandists understand that people eventually believe what they hear most often. The constant hyping of a culture of fear rhetorically scares otherwise reasonable people into irrational emotions and behaviors. It taps directly into the reptilian brain, the survival part, causing rational and higher cognitive capacities to shut down, leaving individuals uniquely vulnerable to manipulation.
The idea of dividing people to maintain control, that's an ancient one, right? Goes back centuries, maybe millennia. Our sources call it divide and conquer, and it seems absolutely foundational to these strategies of subversion and psychological manipulation we're discussing.
It's truly a cornerstone of maintaining power, yes. Machiavelli, for instance, keenly observed that a population united is always stronger than those who rule over it. Therefore, rulers throughout history have sought to divide the many and weaken the force which was strong while it was united. In its modern application, this means actively promoting identifications that divide the population into conflicting groups. Along lines of race, class, religion, gender, or political preference, the goal is always to splinter any potential unified opposition to the ruling elite.
And what are the profound consequences of this deliberate fragmentation? Does it just create disagreement, or does it do something far more destructive to the fabric of society?
It creates an environment where rational discourse and debate between individuals in these separate groups becomes extremely unlikely. Bernays himself observed that each deeply identified group tends to dismiss all contrary or different standards as indefensible. They just automatically reject any viewpoint from the other side without critical thought. When unable to settle differences rationally, groups often revert to more destructive means in their attempt to defeat those they see as a threat, sometimes even violence. This creates increasingly hostile conflict, which paradoxically serves to weaken the population as a whole. And crucially, it diverts their attention away from the actions of those operating behind the scenes. Those who, in Bernays' words, constitute the invisible government who controls the destinies of millions. The internal conflict becomes a constant distraction, preventing a unified focus on the true systemic issues.
This division often seems to boil down to a very visceral us versus them mentality, a basic tribal instinct. What's the psychological root of that, particularly when people are feeling threatened or afraid, as we just discussed?
Well, when people are afraid, they tend to regress to tribalism. This isn't just political. It's described in our sources as a biological loophole that politicians and manipulators have banked on for a long time. Our brains, particularly the reptilian brain focused on survival, are wired to quickly identify friend or foe, threat or safety. This easily fosters the use versus them mentality, making it incredibly difficult to see nuance or compromise or shared humanity. Instead, it solidifies opposition against perceived threats, driving individuals deeper into the safety of their identified group, creating this binary black and white worldview where the other is always wrong or dangerous or both.
This raises an important question. How does this tie into economic and social structures, like the idea of a middle class or the rise of identity politics? How are these concepts leveraged to further divide and control?
The concept of the middle class illusion is, according to some sources, strategically deployed to suppress class consciousness. Even individuals who are struggling financially are encouraged to identify with an idealized middle-class position, which subtly deflects resentment away from the systemic issues of capitalism itself. Instead of recognizing shared economic struggles across different social strata, it redirects anger downwards or sideways towards other groups, scapegoating immigrants perhaps, or other marginalized groups. This keeps people divided along manufactured lines, preventing them from seeing their shared economic interests, and potentially preventing them from uniting against systemic issues that benefit a concentrated elite.
So it's a way to maintain the status quo by turning people against each other, rather than looking at the underlying economic structures. And how does capitalism itself interact with identity politics in this context, especially in a way that might further fragment solidarity?
Capitalism, our sources suggest, is actually very adept at using identity politics to fragment solidarity even further. Now, while identity politics can absolutely be a powerful force for progressive change and recognizing diverse experiences, this perspective argues that it can also be weaponized. By encouraging individuals to, quote, squabble over privilege and focus solely on group-specific grievances, energy gets diverted away from what these specific sources consider the true enemy, capitalism itself, end quote. The political right, in turn, capitalizes on this fragmentation. By twisting class politics into identitarian resentment, appealing to cultural characteristics and anxieties rather than universal economic grievances, this is described as a sophisticated ideological manipulation, suppressing broad class consciousness by pitting different cultural or identity groups against each other, all while the underlying economic structures that benefit elites remain untouched.
It sounds like these mechanisms don't just divide us into conflicting groups, but also work to leave us feeling increasingly isolated, creating a sort of manufactured loneliness within society.
That's a profound and, according to these sources, intentional consequence. The system, they argue, actively works to break the bonds that made life human. The underlying principle being that interdependence is inefficient. Isolation makes us obedient, anxious, and easier to sell to. This manufactured loneliness is explicitly stated as not an accident. That's architecture. Strong family units, strong communities, which historically provided support, resilience, meaning, are actively dismantled because a united home is a threat to the machine. A strong family doesn't need outside control. Instead, men and women are pressured to compete in the workplace, even within social structures, fostering mistrust and distraction within what should ideally be supportive relationships.
So if community and genuine connection are being actively dismantled, what fills that void in our minds? And what's the ultimate impact on our capacity for critical thought, for self-awareness?
Our minds, left with that void, are constantly stimulated with endless, constant, algorithmically filtered noise. This leads, one source argues, to the death of wisdom. A brain that's always stimulated never has time to question, never has time to remember who it is. This constant digital input prevents the deep thought, reflection, and interpersonal connection necessary for developing real wisdom. This process even extends down to childhood, with parenting increasingly outsourced to corporations whose only goal is to keep those children engaged, addicted, and primed for consumption. The result, many fear, is a generation marked by numbness, restlessness, deep disconnection, which is arguably a perfect state for the system to keep us too busy, too distracted, and too isolated to challenge the underlying architecture of control.
The control of information is clearly central to all these strategies. From demoralization right through to manufactured loneliness, how do powerful entities manipulate narratives through media and propaganda, going back through history and extending right into our present day?
This is absolutely a fundamental mechanism deeply ingrained in modern society. Edward Bernays, often credited with inventing the term public relations, openly saw it as an invisible government shaping public thought. And early examples of this propaganda are really stark. The U.S. Committee on Public Information in 1917, for instance, was instrumental in selling WWI to the American people. They did this not by appealing to facts, no, but by appealing directly to raw emotions, with directives to scare the hell out of people and grab them by their emotions to generate support for the war. This really set the stage for how governments and other powerful entities would continue to engage with media to shape public opinion.
And how has that evolved into modern military and political messaging, particularly in the context of conflict?
Today, the Pentagon spends an astonishing amount, almost $1 billion a year, just on advertising, recruiting, propaganda. And that includes, according to sources, contracts with news organizations, which means the very sources we rely on for news can have direct financial ties to military operations. Retired generals often serve as press spokesmen for networks without always revealing their industry connections, creating a subtle but powerful influence on how conflicts are framed for us. During conflicts like the Iraq War, journalists are frequently embedded with military units. While it seems like offering access, this tactic is often designed to create a media-friendly campaign. Controlling what reporters see, where they go, and how they report, it can effectively turn them into stenographers for the official narrative. As most reports emerge from within a system where media outlets have agreed to specific conditions limiting their independent inquiry.
It sounds like a highly curated experience then for both journalists and ultimately for the public. Are there specific instances where this curation became really overt, almost theatrical manipulation?
Absolutely. The infamous toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad, for instance, widely celebrated at the time as a spontaneous act of liberation. Yet our sources reveal it was actually a made-for-TV moment,
Right.
meticulously orchestrated by a U.S. PSYOPs officer to create an illusion of liberation, specifically for television audiences, rather than accurately portraying the bloody conquest that was still very much underway. Journalists who don't conform to these official narratives, well, they risk severe consequences. From losing access entirely to being labeled unpatriotic. Independent journalists like Al Jazeera correspondents in Kabul and Baghdad, or those trying to report on atrocities in Fallujah, have even been targeted or suppressed, according to these accounts. Official sources, we learn, can actively punish journalists for unjustified criticism, making critical reporting a significant career risk. Many journalists, looking back, admitted to being hoodwinked by sophisticated disinformation campaigns, particularly in the run-up to the Iraq War regarding, for example, weapons of mass destruction.
Beyond controlling access and framing events, what other pervasive techniques are consistently used to solidify certain narratives, even falsehoods, in the public mind?
Repetition is a prevalent and incredibly effective propaganda technique used to solidify falsehoods and perpetuate fear. Propagandists understand a fundamental truth of human psychology. People eventually believe what they hear most often. Joseph Goebbels famously understood that sufficient repetition can convince people that a square is, in fact, a circle. This constant repetition, often coupled with emotional appeals, just bypasses critical thought and programs the subconscious. Then there are false flag operations, defined as covert operations designed to deceive in such a way that the operations appear as though they are being carried out by entities, groups, or nations other than those who actually planned and executed them. These are employed to manipulate public perception, create artificial crises, and lead to a corresponding increase of trust in political leaders and submission to them. In times of perceived crisis, the public becomes highly susceptible. People, for the most part, believe what they are told.
The idea of manufacturing consent and trust through staged or deceptive events is deeply chilling. But our sources also dive into even more extreme measures, almost science fiction-like measures of mind control and reality hacking. Can you tell us about the truly disturbing Paul Benowitz case?
The Paul Benowitz case is, yeah, it's a truly disturbing and highly illustrative example of weaponized deception. Benowitz was an electrical engineer living near Kirtland Air Force Base in the late 70s, early 80s. He accidentally stumbled upon two major military secrets: coded transmissions and the testing of stealth aircraft. Now, instead of just addressing the security breaches, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, OSI, with NSA involvement, launched an incredibly insidious disinformation campaign directly against him. They fed him false stories, convincing him that the strange lights he filmed were actually hostile aliens operating from underground alien bases. They even went as far as beaming fake alien transmissions right into his house, and swapped his computer to feed him tailored alien story narratives. This campaign, the sources state, literally destroyed his life, leading to severe mental deterioration. Its purpose was apparently twofold. First, to divert him from the real secrets he had uncovered, and second, to infiltrate the broader UFO community with this disinformation, thereby making anyone seriously interested in UFOs look ridiculous and discrediting legitimate inquiry into the phenomenon.
That's a profound personal example of weaponized deception, where an individual's reality was just completely re-engineered. What about more systemic government efforts to control and maybe even reprogram minds on a larger scale?
This brings us, unfortunately, to Project MKUltra, the infamous CIA program, active from the early 1950s to the early 1970s. Its terrifying goals, now declassified, included attempting to control and even reprogram people's minds.
Okay.
With the aim of potentially creating Manchurian candidates, individuals programmed to act, maybe even assassinate, without memory or conscience. The methods were deeply unethical, brutal, including using powerful hallucinogenic drugs like LSD on unwitting subjects, civilians, soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and developing techniques to remove true memories and replace them with false memories. These operations were a direct, horrifying attack on human identity and autonomy. The program also involved a massive cover-up. Files were deliberately destroyed to prevent discovery and dodge accountability, further eroding public trust and showing the length such entities might go to.
And beyond direct mind control and memory manipulation, the FBI also engaged in significant counterintelligence efforts. That sounds a lot like strategic subversion, aimed at disrupting internal movements within the U.S.
Indeed. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, active from 1956 to 1971. It involved surveillance of critics, blackmailing Martin Luther King Jr. to try and force him out of the civil rights movement, and actively infiltrating activist groups, even pushing them towards violence to discredit them. This directly illustrates the use of secret agents not just to observe, but to instigate violence within targeted groups. The goal wasn't to solve a problem or bring justice, but to create a pretext for discrediting and controlling these groups, thereby controlling the narrative and public perception of dissent. It's a stark example of a government entity using covert means to manipulate and neutralize perceived domestic threats.
Okay, we've explored the long game of ideological subversion, the subtle psychological tools of manipulation, and even these extreme measures taken to control narratives. How do these all converge in moments of real-world crisis, particularly when violence occurs? And how can such events be strategically leveraged to consolidate power?
Well, if we connect this back to the bigger picture, a violent incident, especially one targeting a public figure, can be strategically leveraged to fulfill Bezmenov's crisis stage perfectly, creating that powerful demand for a savior. Such an event triggers an immediate and profound sense of fear within a population. When individuals are gripped by fear of a threat, real or imagined, their rational and higher cognitive capacities shut down, end quote, making them easily manipulated by anyone that promises safety from the threat. As Edmund Burke observed centuries ago, no passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear. This creates a critical window for those seeking to exert more control.
So fear essentially short-circuits rational thought, makes people more pliable, more desperately seeking guidance. How does this translate into a potent political opportunity for a leader, specifically?
For political figures, this creates a really critical window to consolidate power. By surviving such an event, or maybe just by being strongly associated with its aftermath, A leader can be powerfully positioned as the savior the fearful populace craves, that strongman, that leader that Messiah Bezmenov talked about. The narrative then suggests this leader possesses the unique strength and will to protect the nation from similar dangers. An attack on a leader also intensely reinforces the perceived threat to their group, causing individuals to subordinate self-analysis and a discerning search for the truth in favor of maintaining group interests and cohesion. In this heightened emotional state, critical introspection becomes nearly impossible, making them highly susceptible to psychological operations. The figure becomes a powerful symbol, consolidating loyalty, attracting new supporters who identify with the collective victimhood and the promise of protection.
And how does our modern media landscape just amplify these effects?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to a crisis or a violent event. It seems almost designed to maximize impact.
Oh, the media, particularly 24-hour news cycles and social media, play an absolutely crucial role in amplifying this. The 24-hour news environment often acts as a giant echo chamber and is arguably most easy to manipulate. Social media algorithms, as we discussed, often prioritize outrage because outrage works really well at getting attention. And it encourages rapid sharing, quickly disseminating desired interpretations, often drowning out nuance or critical analysis. Information is effectively weaponized as dopamine to overwhelm, distract, and reduce your mind into something passive, preventing sustained critical engagement. Our sources highlight that in times of crisis, people are prone to rely upon what they're told and will, for the most part, believe what they're told, which is precisely why such events are so potent for shaping public perception and driving specific policy outcomes.
Let's bring this into a very current context then, drawing from our sources and a recent tragic event. We're looking at the reported shooting of Charlie Kirk at Utah Valley University, and subsequently, his death. And we also have an update. A suspect has now been apprehended. How might an event like this be understood through the lens of weaponized fear and control using the frameworks we've just discussed?
The sources provide specific context here. Charlie Kirk was described as a divisive figure, a polarizing lightning rod, and one of the most influential conservative leaders in the Maguey movement. He was known for actively rallying youth conservative voices, building a large organization, frequently on tour, giving speeches, engaging in debates on college campuses. The event itself was shot fired during one such event, leading to chaos, his confirmed death, and now the apprehension of a suspect instantly created that profound sense of crisis and fear we just talked about.
So, with the event itself creating fear, a polarizing figure as the victim, and a suspect now in custody, how might this be leveraged to shape a narrative, especially concerning the need for a savior or for expanded control?
Well, the apprehension of a suspect, while bringing immediate resolution to the manhunt phase, strategically shifts the narrative from chaos to maybe prevention and justice. It can be presented as validation that law and order prevails, reinforcing belief in a strong government or decisive leadership. It can be spun as proof that a specific, tougher approach to crime or dissent is effective and necessary, positioning aligned political figures as the savior who can protect the nation from such threats. Simultaneously, the suspect's identity, motives, affiliations, they will likely be meticulously scrutinized and very likely strategically framed. If linked, however tenuously, to an opposing ideology or a marginalized group, it could intensely amplify that us versus them tribalism, strengthening group cohesion among the victim supporters and demonizing the perceived other tribe. And crucially, the fear psychosis generated by the incident persists, creating fertile ground for justifying expanded state powers and more aggressive policies.
So, what does this all mean for you, our listener? How could an event like Kirk's death, even with a suspect in custody, become a catalyst for more control, more power, more right-wing, more ICE in cities, and more oppression in the name of safety, as you specifically asked, based on the frameworks we've explored?
This is where the mechanisms we've discussed converge, really directly and powerfully. For more control and power, the rhetoric will very likely shift strongly towards prevention. The argument will be made that such violence must never happen again, justifying increased surveillance, data collection, rapid response systems. Our sources describe a trajectory towards societies of control where power expands and permeates the entirety of society. Technologies like Gorgon's Stare providing omnipresent aerial surveillance of cities, AI systems like Palantir with predictive capabilities to anticipate unrest, dissent, individual actions, these are already deployed. The capture of the suspect in this context can be used to legitimize and accelerate the acceptance of these pervasive control mechanisms, framing it as, look, this worked, but we need more of it to stop the next threat. It subtly normalizes constant monitoring, all in the name of safety.
And how would this specifically contribute to an increase in right-wing influence, potentially reshaping government policy and public discourse in that direction?
For more right-wing influence, well, if the suspect's ideology is presented as antithetical to Kirk's conservative values, it could fuel a strong demand for policies targeting perceived ideological enemies, especially those framed as threats to traditional values or social order. Kirk's established role in rallying youth conservative voices and promoting a MAGA future can galvanize a movement to further entrench these values. This acts as a powerful counter-narrative to that idea of societal demoralization we discussed earlier, strengthening calls for a return to traditional principles, consolidating support for a strongman leader who promises to restore order and protect these values. The tragedy can be used to frame the political opposition not just as wrong, but as a direct violent threat, thereby strengthening the call for a specific right-wing response.
Finally, how does this translate into calls for more ICE-eaten cities and oppression in the name of safety? A very specific concern you raised, our listener.
This links directly to what our sources call the authoritarian consolidation stage, where government uses its power to hound its enemies and entrench its own power. The sources mention the deployment of the National Guard to cities, masked ICE agents conducting raids, refusing to reveal their faces, badge numbers, or warrants as existing tools of state power. The fear generated by Kirk's death, even with a suspect caught, could be exploited to expand these tactics significantly. Any link, however tenuous or even just implied, between the suspect and groups deemed undesirable, particularly those related to immigration or civil unrest, could become pretext for increased federal presence, more aggressive crackdowns, a further erosion of civil liberties, and all of these actions would be framed as essential for safety and order, leveraging the public's anxiety to justify a more heavy-handed approach by the state. The narrative of ensuring public safety becomes the justification for heightened state power and potentially oppressive policies against perceived threats, both foreign and domestic.
We've covered a vast amount of ground today, peeling back the layers on ideological subversion, the subtle art of mind manipulation, how societal divisions are weaponized. It's clear that the forces shaping our reality, and even how we react to crisis, are far more complex, deliberate, and deeply integrated than many of us typically imagine.
This deep dive truly reveals how intimately human psychology, media ecosystems, and political strategy are intertwined.
Yeah.
From the long game of demoralization right through to the rapid strategic leveraging of crisis, the goal is often to control our attention, program our beliefs, and ultimately guide our behavior, leading to what some call a manufactured consent. Understanding these mechanisms is, well, it's the first step towards seeing the invisible forces at play around us.
So what does this all mean for you, our engaged listener, as you navigate your daily life with this new understanding?
This raises a really important question, I think. In an age where truth can feel fluid, where our attention is constantly being monetized, and fear such a potent political tool, how do we cultivate not just critical thinking, but also a profound resilience? Resilience against these pervasive attempts to program our minds and fracture our communities. The challenge, perhaps, is to recognize that the pursuit of safety can sometimes be used as a Trojan horse for oppression, and that true freedom requires constant vigilance, not just of external threats, but of the narratives we allow to define our reality, and maybe those silent architectures shaping our lives without us even noticing.
Food for thought, indeed. Thank you for joining us on this essential deep dive. Stay curious, stay questioning, and keep seeking out those sensible conclusions.